Is Linear B Deciphered? By Douglas Young. Professor Saul Levin has made a most helpful contribution in the Linear B decipherment controversy, re-examined, State University of New York, 1964. He studies closely Michael Ventris's procedures in assigning values to the supposed phonetic signs of the Linear B binary, and criticizes in detail the values assigned, concluding that only a minority of them can be verified by strict criteria. He goes on to advance the thesis that Linear B texts contain at least one non-Greek language, with non-Greek vocabulary and non-Greek structural features, in addition to whatever Greek elements they contain. This doctrine will be hotly disputed by many Ventrisians, followers of Ventris, more dogmatic than their coryphaeus. Levin himself writes in a non-partisan tone, clearly and often with wit. In spite of its title, his book is not primarily a re-examination of the controversy about the proposed decipherment, but it may help in assessing it if, before discussing in detail Levin's own views, I sketch the main lines on which the battle has been raging for the past dozen years. I write as a reporter, not as a controversialist, suppressing my innate praefervidum ingenium Scotorum, and have in fact an open mind on the extent to which Ventris may have been right in his theory about the Linear B documents. For lack of sufficient evidence, I continue to suspend judgment, like very many Greek scholars who have not rushed into print on the subject. In 1965, the leading Ventrisian philologist Leonard R. Palmer testified that, in quotes, opposition continues, and agnosticism is still widespread among professional classical scholars, who maintain that there is no strict proof that the decipherment is correct, end quote. In brackets, Mycenaeans and Minoans, edition 2, 1965, page 62. In 1953, the Journal of Hellenic Studies published the article by Ventris and John Chadwick, his collaborator since July 1952, on evidence for Greek dialect in the Mycenaean archives, brackets equals JHS evidence. In 1956 they issued their fine volume, Documents in Mycenaean Greek, brackets equals docs, in which 300 selected tablets of Linear B were printed in a transcription based upon Ventris's evaluation of about 2/3 of the total Linear B binary, with translations and commentaries, and a vocabulary of supposed Mycenaean Greek words. The Ventris system, thus set forth, has been widely accepted by Greek scholars, including many of the highest eminence in many countries. It has also been widely rejected by scholars of eminence in varying degrees. The names of its supporters are listed in Chadwick's popular account, The Decipherment of Linear B, in brackets 1958, in brackets equals Decipher, and one may read very competent and to some extent plausible defences of the system by L. R. Palmer, Professor of Comparative Philology at Oxford, as in his Mycenaeans and Minoans, in brackets 2 edition 1965, by F. Sharkameyer in Saeculum 10, in brackets 1959, 48-72, 374-379, and by others. Among its opponents, the best known are Professor Ernst Grumack, editor of the review Cadmos, and Professor Arthur J. Beattie of Edinburgh, formerly lecturer in Greek dialects at Cambridge University, and tutor of Dr. John Chadwick. The veteran Belgian Hellenist Henry Gregoire listed some more of the opponents who had printed objections to the Ventris scheme in La Nouvelle Clio 10-12, in brackets 1958-1962, 193-198. In his article, La Linear B est il decipheré. Among exponents of a skepticism which he found to be gaining ground daily, Gregoire noted Sandwell, Palatino, McPheeters, Buchholz, Levin, Oka, Ehlers, and Dr. W. C. Bryce of Manchester University, the man chosen by Sir John Myers to publish the material classed by Evans as Linear A. Bryce is a diligent, scrupulous, and modest researcher, thoroughly familiar with both the Linear A and the Linear B material, and with other writing systems from the East Mediterranean and Near Eastern background, which makes his skepticism the more significant. Bryce is a diligent, scrupulous, and modest researcher, thoroughly familiar with both the Linear A and the Linear B material, and with other writing systems from the East Mediterranean and Near Eastern background, which makes his skepticism the more significant. So far as personalities go, a most impressive fact is the result of the seminar on Linear B material conducted for years in the University of London, with the lead taken by my old friend and former Aberdeen colleague Eric G. Turner, Professor of Papyrology. Ventris himself participated, till his lamented death in a car crash in 1956, with a galaxy of indisputably excellent philologists contributing. The London seminar was, I understand, unanimous in accepting the basic features of Ventris's proposed decipherment, while admitting a great deal of room for disagreement on details. The unanimity of so many well-qualified Hellenists is remarkable. There has been no comparable concerted study by opponents of the Ventris theory, though Professor Beattie organised some useful symposia at Edinburgh. London may be considered the centre of what may be called the Bible Belt of the Ventrisian faithful. Cambridge, England is also a stronghold, with Chadwick installed there. Its Regius Professor of Greek, Dennis Page, is himself a believer, though sometimes a bit of a liability to the Ventrisians, as when, in his book History and the Homeric Iliad, in brackets 1959, page 204, n. 26, he wrote about, in quotation, the stark unreliability of the evidence, end quote. In some 3,500 Linear B tablets studied, about 75% of the supposed phonetic sign groups are interpreted as names of persons or places. About these names, Page remarks, in brackets page 196, quotation, the ambiguity inherent in the spelling system obscures all distinction between antiphos and artipus, between hagatus and akastas, between charon and kalon, and so forth. A very high proportion of the total number is thus ambiguous or else wholly unintelligible. End quote. At Oxford, Palmer is the fugleman of the Ventrisians, but a good deal of uncoordinated dissent is occasionally voiced. Dons are apt privately to repeat the bon mot of an eminent former Oxonian scholar. In quotes, I suppose we may take it that Ventris proved that Linear B is not Greek. End quote. It has become a kind of parlour game to exploit the spelling rules devised by Ventris. These Ventrisian rules enable bits of a curious sort of Greek to be got out of Linear B texts, but experiments have shown that bits of English or Latin or other tongues, when spelt out in syllables according to the Ventrisian system, are capable often of yielding bits of Greek just as plausible as anything in the Ventris-Chadwick documents volume. One eminent Oxonian, dining at a high table, amused himself by taking the names of the fellows of the college present and turning them into Ventrisian syllables, from which he made a new translation of them into Greek, in which they all turned out to be Greek gods. For some British Hellenists, this game has replaced the crossword puzzle as a pastime for journeys. Reviewing skeptical attacks in general, I find that they have proceeded on 4 fronts. 1. The cryptographic, regarding Ventris's use of a grid for classifying signs before evaluation. 2. The personal or biographical, relating to Ventris's proceedings as revealed in his work notes, in brackets equals WN, and elsewhere. 3. The general plausibility of the results. 4. Particular conflicts between supposed phonetic content and relevant numerals or ideograms. On the cryptographic front, Beattie led the main attack, and Levin has done some useful mopping up. The Ventris decipherment is a proposal for breaking the code of a hitherto secret script, possibly used for an unknown language, or for more than one unknown language. Hence the importance of testing the validity of Ventris's grid arrangements and his use of them. Ventris and Chadwick claim that the grid was basic to the decipherment. In the 1953 JHS evidence article they wrote, in brackets page 88, quotation, "The consonant and vowel equations tabulated below had all been deduced from internal evidence before any phonetic values were allotted. They are based partly on inflectional evidence, partly on accidental or deliberate spelling variations. If correctly determined, these equations enable the most frequent signs of the syllabary to be arranged in a two-dimensional pattern or grid, which we must expect to be adhered to by any suggested system of phonetic values. The problem of decipherment is in this way reduced to the correct distribution of 5 vowels and 12 consonants to the columns of the grid. And, since a proposed reading of only 2 or 3 words may, by a chain reaction, predetermine rigid values for almost the entire syllabary, a very severe discipline is imposed on the earliest stages of a decipherment. If the initial moves are wrong, it should be quite impossible to force any part of the text into showing the slightest conformity with the vocabulary or grammar of a known language, even though that might be quite easy if one were free to juggle with the values of 88 mutually unconnected signs." End quotation. Later in 1956, in brackets docs page 20, Ventris and Chadwick discussed again the grid as it stood in February 1952, in brackets equals grid 3 of a classification to be discussed shortly, before decipherment began, and they claimed, quotation, "In spite of its incomplete nature, the grid had the virtue of being founded entirely on internal evidence, dispassionately sifted, and not on any biased attempt to identify the language or give values to the signs." End quotation. They go on to state, quotation, "It was tempting to compare Cypriot values, but clearly unrealistic. Sign 3 might be taken at its Cypriot value of pa, but it was then impossible to read 75 in quite another line of the grid as pe by the same analogy." End quotation. In fact, as some critics allege, including Levin, it can be shown that Ventris used Cypriot values for several of the signs in the system he finally evolved. Further, some who have read Ventris's work notes, circulated to fellow students in the year 1950 to 1952, of which microfilm copies are available from the University of London Institute of Classical Studies, found reasons to suspect a series of what they considered biased attempts to identify the language as Greek and to give values to the signs accordingly. At this point, let it be recalled that Ventris in 1936, aged 14, heard a lecture on Minoan scripts by Sir Arthur Evans and made a schoolboy vow to solve their problems. Early in 1950, he issued a questionnaire to scholars working on the Minoan scripts, the languages of the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, usually called the Mid-Century Report. After that, he sent out a series of 20 work notes, in brackets equals WN, totaling 176 foolscap pages. These contain 3 states of the grid, which may conveniently be called Grid 1, in brackets WN1, 28th of January 1951, Grid 2, in brackets WN15, 28th September 1951, and Grid 3, in brackets WN17, 20th February 1952. Grid 4 is that found in JHS evidence, in brackets page 86, in 1953, and further modified in docs, in brackets page 23, in 1956. Before beginning to make a grid, Ventris made certain assumptions about the signary called by Evans Minoan Linear B. He assumed that about 87 signs were phonetic, in brackets docs page 41, and the rest, over 150, were ideograms, in brackets docs 50 FF. The difficulty in giving exact figures is that students do not agree when a particular form is an independent sign, and when it is a variant, local or temporal or personal, of some other sign. Note that some phonetic signs also serve as ideograms, and it is not always possible to distinguish phonetic signs, which usually occur in groups, the group separated by word dividers, from ideograms, which usually occur singly. There are those who entertain the possibility that the signary is basically a repertory of about 240 ideographic signs, used for restricted ritual purposes. From early Egyptian cult practice, it is suggested that a cult signary of such dimensions is perfectly feasible and plausible, and it would be in line with theories about Greek importation of deities and rituals from Egypt. Be that as it may, Ventris assumed that about 1/3 of the 240 or so signs were phonetic, not ideographic. Of his 87 supposedly phonetic signs, about 70 were common or very common on the tablets and fragments available for study. Studies in their relative frequencies had been pursued by, among others, Mr. Konstantinos D. Tistopoulos in Greece and Dr. Emmett L. Bennett, Jr. in USA. Apparent alternations of signs, related possibly to gender or number, had been studied also, notably by the American Miss Alice Kober.